Hi, welcome to my final year forum. I'm going to sort of breeze past first year, but I'd like to start by talking about what I did before coming to university, because I think it's somewhat relevant to the work I've produced throughout my time at Newcastle. After college, I spent some time working in a factory as a production worker, and I was doing really repetitive work that I think most people would find quite tedious. But I found myself being quite fond of that tedium, because there's something I find quite comforting, and sort of always have, about giving yourself over to a repetitive mechanical process, be it like knitting or peeling a bag of potatoes or operating a heat press on a production line. I think this was a catalyst to regarding the body as an object of utility, which has been something of a thematic through line in the work I've produced at university. When it came to formulating our own projects in second semester of first year, I began looking at work that conflated human biology with more artificial, or I suppose like man-made structures and mechanisms, such as Donna Haraway's essay A Cyborg Manifesto, in which she posits the increasingly blurred boundaries between the traditionally distinct cultural and the natural as being a source of liberation, as it allows for the breakdown of essentialist roles. I also became quite interested in the infographics of Fritz Kahn, who drew analogies between the automated systems occurring within us, like breathing or seeing or feeling, and the mechanised processes of an industrial factory or, sometimes a car engine. I took a lot of stylistic inspiration from the Japanese architectural movement of metabolism, which regarded the city as a living organism with metabolic cycles. This all sort of coalesced into the work that I exhibited as part of the late shows at the end of the year. This was envisaging a map of the body if it were to mutate out and morph with the world around it. So veins and arteries would become roads and vital organs would become these sort of architectural structures. For example, here we have a big and small intestine and a rib cage and an eyeball and what is obviously a kidney. Like most people, I spent first year experimenting with different materials and techniques. Before university, I'd worked almost exclusively in paint, but I started working in ceramics, which has since been at the core of my practice. Using clay as a medium seemed to meld really well with the reoccurring themes of my practice, in that it could be used to construct these somewhat structural forms, like I've just shown, but at the same time, sculpting something from clay felt far from a mechanical process. Clay to me felt intrinsically linked to the body. It's an incredibly tactile and organic material, as well as appearing in a number of creation myths as being the substance from which humans are made. Moving on to the start of second year, the work I was producing at this time felt quite directionless. After first year, I didn't have much of a sense of what sort of work I produced. Considerations of the body were still pretty central to my practice, and after a period of being quite ill in the summer, I began to consider themes of bodily alienation. Periods of sickness, it seemed to me, were paradoxically one of the times when we are most aware of our bodies, while also feeling the most distant from them, and the most unrecognisable to ourselves. I was reading Jack Hartnell's book Medieval Bodies, in which he describes the medieval view of the physical self as being completely synchronous with the world around it. In the majority of cultures Hartnell examines, the body was seen as, in his words, open and porous, making it highly susceptible to its surroundings. My work centred around the idea that in our society we're dissuaded from confronting ourselves as vulnerable living bodies. Modern medicine, diet, and our technology's ability to distance ourselves from cold and pathogens all conspire to make us less conscious of our innate biological fragility. I'd researched the work of artist Paul Tech as part of my art history module, and was interested in his relationship to the body through the creation of his reliquaries. My work at this time focused around making display cases, in inverted commas, to house disembodied limbs and organs, to act as apparatus of objectification, which would thereby other what is recognisably human, as you can see from these terrible sketches. The bulk of this first semester work remained unresolved, partly because I didn't regard it as particularly successful, but mostly because as we faced our first national lockdown and daily death counts became a part of everyday life, making work that revolved around a societal disregard of bodily fragility suddenly seemed, to say the least, ill-judged. Although I hadn't abandoned these themes completely, I'd moved out of the city and back to a more rural setting of my parents' house. During the first lockdown, I'd been watching a lot of film and television that depicted rural environments as disturbing, surreal, and the backdrop to horror and violence. In all these, there is this underlying pagan sense of dark, ancient, existential menace in a rural or natural setting, which threatens human fragility. Despite the passage of time and the technological sophistication of our society, these fears and the imagery associated with them appear hard-baked into our culture and still cause a visceral reaction in us today. I was trying to depict the aftermath of scenes where humans had collided with nature. These were a series of works I'd made by photocopying models of body parts, some of which were encrusted in salt crystals. I'd also photocopied mould, moss, wire, grass, dirt, and human hair. They were meant to sort of resemble crime scene photos, and although I like this work, I don't feel it reflects the sense of unease I was trying to get across. More than one person has said to me my work reminds them of the Teletubbies. I think that's down to my obsession with putting handles on everything, but it doesn't really do much to evoke menace. I won't dwell much on the work from first semester. I carried on looking at rural settings. In the vaguest possible terms, my work revolved mainly around my experiences of nature and rural landscapes and how being in these settings appeals to basic human needs. But being at university without much access to the rural surroundings on which I'd based much of this work made the exploration of these ideas pretty unsustainable. It was also in semester one that my heavy reliance on ceramics as a medium started working to my detriment. I was wanting to work at a bigger scale than I had done in the past, but with the limited access to studios, workshops, and in my case, space, this proved to be more of a challenge than I had anticipated. These sort of skeletal frames I was looking to produce as symbols of human intervention on landscape were incredibly fragile and had a habit of mysteriously breaking on days when I wasn't in the studio. I saw a lot of the work I produced this semester as mock-ups for planned larger pieces rather than acting as works in their own right. While I was spending Christmas and then lockdown at my family home, my attention turned towards issues of technology, communication and isolation. It seemed there was a desire for human connection that can only be fulfilled through communicating with friends over Zoom or on the phone. While technology proved helpful, it was ultimately insufficient in satiating this human need for contact. I became interested in obsolete forms of communication at this time, which led me to research Cold War number stations used to transmit coded information, many of which are still operational despite being quite old forms of technology associated with a bygone age. They suggested to me a strong sense of hidden isolation and the feeling of attempting to communicate messages by throwing them into an apparent void. I started planning these two towers that would communicate with each other through a piece of sound work. I worked to transpose the elegy of Soviet composer and pianist Dmitri Shostakovich's String Quartet No. 15 into Morse code by taking the sheet music, writing out all the chords, and then translating those chords using a text-to-audio Morse code converter. I'll maybe try and play a little bit here so you get an idea of what I'm talking about. There's two sides to the song, and then the idea is that the towers would sing the music back and forth to one another, so the plan was that this would be accomplished by hiding a speaker on each of the towers to transmit the sound. The string quartet itself is a piece of music that I think tonally reflected a sense of loneliness and yearning, and as an elegy expressed a lament of death, decay and loss, as the two towers sort of reflect on their own impending obsolescence. Needless to say, Morse code is quite a bad method of communication to transpose music into. You lose a lot of information and you absolutely lose any tone or emotion to the piece, which is sort of one of the reasons I chose to use it. The towers are attempting to have an emotional outburst, but the tools they're using to do so are really inefficient. This image here is a digital work that I made in Photoshop that I've since screen printed of the Morse code written out that I'm planning to sort of act as an accompanying sheet music to go along with the towers. Which brings us to fourth year, and I've spent quite a lot of this semester attempting to finish work that I'd begun to plan at the end of last year. Obviously I don't have much in the way of resolved work to show at the moment. I'm casting the dishes for the towers and it took quite a bit longer than I'd expected to make this sort of contraption to form domes out of plaster. I've been looking into sound mirrors and parabolic microphones for listening to birds and come to the conclusion that rather than having the dishes being functionally useless, I wanted the dishes to work as parabolic reflectors that would bounce off the sound that was being played into them, and it would project out into the room. Testing this out would probably require a bigger, shallower dish than these ones. I'll have to cast a new former to shape them with the right dimensions. I've done these in clay, but feel casting these in another material such as concrete might avoid any comparison to bowls and would be evocative of sound mirrors from which I've taken inspiration. I've also been designing and drawing up plans for the base of the dishes in AutoCAD, which I plan to cut out of metal, but I need to have the dishes finished first in order to sort of get the dimensions right for that. I'd been looking to get all this done in the next couple of weeks, but with interim approaching, I've been thinking about the sort of thing I'd ultimately like to make for Degree Show, and although I'm still working on this, it has sort of been put to the back burner as it doesn't feel like a great culmination of the work I've created at university. I've also been working on this piece as a sort of representation of caregiving. The idea was to have this sort of caregiving figure illustrated in this drawing that would appear to be nurturing smaller versions of itself through copper wires that would be attached to these sort of jacks at the front. The figure was inspired in part by the 1962 short stop motion The Cybernetic Grandma by Czech animator Jiří Trinka, in which a girl's grandma is replaced by a machine who acts really cruelly towards her, all the while talking to her in a really kind and soft-spoken way. It felt to me that this sort of reflected this incapacity of technology to fulfill a human role that I've been interested in. I feel like I want to make work that more aesthetically fuses the ideas of post-humanism with a sort of grounded and grimy quality. I take quite a lot of inspiration from film when making art, especially quite bleak sci-fi from the 1960s and 70s, while the worlds and technology can look quite lived in and crap. I think I like how they can sit in a really indeterminate space and can paradoxically exist as both depictions of the future and the past. They can seem rooted in nostalgia to me, even though they're from a time I've never lived through, and that's what I was attempting to capture in these forms that I'm making, something of sort of indeterminate origin. I wanted to have smaller versions of the figures encrusted in borax salt crystals, which, as you can see from this experiment I did in second year, grow off fired clay if you suspend it in a solution of the salt and water. I want it to seem like something is growing off these figures as a result of the nurture from their larger counterpart, but that what is being cultivated is something really static and inflexible. I like the idea that salt inhibits the growth of organic matter, and that the larger of the set could be simultaneously a loving and oppressive figure in the care it's giving. This had also been meant as a reference to the room in Andrei Tarkovsky's 1979 film Stalker, that allegedly grants the wishes of those who enter it, which I'd misremembered to be filled with salt, but on rewatching I realised was actually just a lot of dust, so maybe doesn't reference the film in the way I'd wanted it to. I'm feeling at the moment that my ideas haven't quite gelled into a cohesive plan, and I'm questioning whether pursuing ceramics as a medium necessarily makes sense in relation to the themes of my practice, but I'd really appreciate your feedback and any ideas you have. Thank you so much for listening, and bye!